Bam.
This is Robert Hunter, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
This is great. I love that we get to have these conversations. When I met at a NATO convention, basically, where they were celebrating the 70th anniversary of NATO, you were the featured speaker. My buddy Rich and I presented a paper on religion and how we often ignore these things when it comes to foreign policy type efforts. And it was great to have you grab me after the show and say, hey, what you guys are doing is really important. And how often does something like this happen where the ambassador talks to the dudes that went on the ground and did the thing,
Lots of us. We're thick on the ground, we ambassadors, we ex-ambassadors. There are something like 1,800 ambassadors at any time. So this is a glut in the market. But I'm happy to be with you. This is the best show I know that one can find anywhere in the country. Steve Turner is the Break It Down show. That's the place to be.
That is the place to be.
You get some honest conversation.
Yeah. So let's have an honest conversation. I don't know what we're doing as a nation with our foreign policy. And whatever we're doing, are we good at it? Like, are we good at getting things done? And so right now I'm being critical of the Biden administration, but he's also handed this pile of a mess by every previous administration. So when you look at this as an expert at foreign policy, does this make sense to you, what you see going on?
Well, first we have to understand what day it is today. Today is the 10th of November.
Right.
Tomorrow is the 83rd anniversary, 93rd, whatever it is, 103rd, the end of the Great War.
Right.
And it's also now we shall commemorate it as Veterans Day. 2 days ago, we had an election in this country. And the important thing about the election, not who won and who lost and all that, is that democracy worked.
Yeah.
All the naysayers, particularly in the media, who've been saying that democracy is finished, were wrong.
Yeah,
right. We can run an election in this country. We're not a third world country. We're not a banana republic. We are a country that thrives on democracy. And the American people, God love them all, decided to come together, each in their own political persuasion, and said, let's make it work. So that was a great achievement. Now you won't hear the media admitting that because they never admit anything wrong.
But you have to talk about existential.
So, what that means is the outside world now looks at us and looks at Mr. Biden and his foreign policy. They are now going to have greater confidence. Because in order to have a foreign policy that works, you've got to have a country that's working. You have to have a president who, when he speaks to the country, might get some kind of resonance. And that starts off with people having a greater comfort about how we are doing things at home. Because all foreign policy in every country is ultimately grounded in the will or the lack of will of the people. So this is a great day for democracy, and hence, no matter who would be president right now, a good time for looking to the future, what we need to do. Now, that's my peroration at the beginning. Why don't you restate your question, and I'll do my best with it.
So the question basically is when I look at how we perform, and this administration, previous ones, I know they're all linked, but when the president calls a country and they're not going to answer the phone, when when our domestic policy impacts our foreign policy in a negative way, where we have to go ask for things on the global market, our relationship, dealing with Ukraine, Turkey, all of these complex things, NATO, all of this stuff, I look at it and I look at the history of the people that are in charge right now. And I'm not terribly confident that they're doing a good job, but you're the expert, and that's why I'm talking to you. And this isn't political, right? It's about capacity, and it's about the ability to do this with some elegance and a little bit of efficiency.
Well, to begin with, any foreign leader who doesn't answer the phone when the president's calling is stupid.
Right.
Because, as this president and other presidents say, that we're a pretty important country. We have a lot of say in the world. Sometimes we do it better than other times, but nobody can be indifferent to what's going on in the United States. The markets have responded. You may have noticed that inflation is lower than it was. And I can't remember another day when the stock market went up. The Dow was up 900 and something points. The
That's right.
NASDAQ is up 600 and something. Well, that resonates around the world too. Okay. Now, we have to start with a little bit of history.
Okay.
The Cold War came to an end, officially, I guess you'd say, not just with the opening of the Berlin Wall on 9/11. No, sorry, 11/9, excuse me. November the 9th.
11.
November the 9th, am I right with that? We
I
don't
think
even
that's right.
remember anymore, but okay. So the Berlin Wall came over. We don't even remember anymore. But officially came to an end, I guess, on Christmas Day when the Soviet Union came to an end.
Right.
There was a NATO meeting going on, and which had everybody, including the Soviets, there, and they had what's called a family photo, in which all the leaders get up there and get their photos taken so they can use it back home. And they had all the flags. In the middle of this, a hand reached behind the curtain and took out the flag of the Soviet Union and put in the flag of Russia. Fantastic symbolic thing. Well, a lot of people at that point say, we won, the Soviet Union lost, sole superpower, end of history. Some person who should have known better, but didn't then, doesn't now. I'm not going to name him. End of history, everything's going on, but it wasn't true. Some of us said at the time, it's not a matter of we can now rest on our laurels and stop what I call my favorite phrase, strategic thinking. We have to do more, because all these countries that sheltered under our wing against the big bad boys in the Kremlin no longer had to do it. And they could start thinking of themselves again with understanding how important we were. And some groups in this country decided to take advantage of it, some didn't. But in general, we had what I called a holiday from history. It went on for, that's 1991 to 2001 on 9/11. Incidentally, it's the reverse of 11/9. The Europeans right there, dates backwards.
Right.
And suddenly we had not a weapon of mass destruction against the country, but a weapon of mass psychological disruption. It was not a big deal in terms of the number of people killed. It was 1/4 of what we lost in Antietam in a single day.
Right.
But it was 3,000 people. It was the first time that we had been attacked in the lower 48 since August the 23rd of 1814, when the British came calling. We did have Pearl Harbor, but it wasn't against the mainland. I guess there was an exception when Pancho Villa came at one point.
Oh, you know what? Yeah.
You remember Pancho Villa. And then Blackback Pershing went down and took care of him.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So suddenly we realized we were back in the world again. We were going to pay attention. But I would say what we call required is strategic thinking did not take over. I was honored to be involved in the one great area in which was done after the Cold War, which was European security. George H.W. Bush, who I think, you can tell I'm a Democrat probably already, the last truly serious foreign policy president we had, who really had it together, came up with a phrase, let's try to create a Europe whole and free and at peace. Now, what did he mean by that? It means it's a y'all come party. Everybody has to be involved. And part of the idea, which was then picked up by Bill Clinton, and I had the honor to be his ambassador at NATO and helped to put all this together, was to include Russia. Not to do to Russia what was done at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919.
Right.
When Germany, after an armistice, incidentally, it was not a surrender, it was an armistice, was required to accept full responsibility for what happened in starting the First World War. That was needed, the lawyers said, was needed in order to have a juridical basis for reparations. You had to have a guilt clause in there, clause 231 in the Treaty of Versailles, which was written by two young lawyers who were working for Woodrow Wilson, one of whom, his name will be familiar to you, John Foster Dulles.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Secretary of State. Okay, he did that. So the idea of Bush and then with Clinton was, we don't want to do that again. We don't want to stigmatize the Soviet Union. Okay, we know. communism failed. It lost. It was the biggest collapse in peacetime history of any empire ever. Both the Soviet external empire in Central Europe and its internal empire came to an end, broke into 15 separate parts, and still, except for a little bit at the edge of what's happened in Crimea, and the fact that some of these parts are more loyal to Moscow than others. For example, Mr. Lukashenko in Belarus is a kind of a clone of Mr. Putin, but he still keeps a little bit of distance. But we didn't do, in my judgment, the strategic thinking that was needed. What do you do now? So what happened is people who left the government who understood this about 1999, and certainly by the young Bush administration. And instead of saying, we got to not push the Russians away, they said they lost. We can do whatever we want. So we did a lot of things. We abrogated the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Okay, fine. We didn't have a nuclear confrontation with Russia anymore. They abrogated the treaty on nuclear forces in Europe. They started deploying anti-ballistic missiles in Central Europe, which was not directed against the Soviet Union, but it was a poke in the eye. Poke in the eye. Why did we put it? Because of concern about North Korea. I don't know how you work out the geometry of that. A missile coming from North Korea to the United States has to be intercepted in Europe, but I'll leave that to the geopoliticians. And also Iran. Well, Iran still could not have a weapon that could reach us if they went hell-bent for leather for a number of years now. But okay, we did that. Okay, the Russians misbehaved too. They built some missiles they shouldn't have under the intermediate range talks. They got out of the agreement in regard to conventional forces in Europe. And of course, they did some other things because they are Russians. But one has to remember, Russia supported us in the Bosnia War.
That's right.
When it came to an end, and we put in an implementation force after Dayton in order to keep the peace. You were involved in that?
Yeah.
Implementation force. And frankly, there hasn't been any fighting in Bosnia now since 1995. I don't know how many years that is. It's a long time.
Who knew?
At that time, the American-led implementation force under NATO, Russia said, we want to be part of that. Come on, let's be part of it. And so, but we can't be under NATO. Oh, that'd be a terrible thing. NATO, at one point, a Russian defense minister meeting with Bill Perry, our defense minister, said, we don't have a problem with NATO, but please change the name. And we said, come on, we can't change the name. It's a great name. Everybody in America supports NATO. It is maybe the only, that along with support for Israel, the only bipartisan issue in American foreign policy. Always. Everybody supports NATO and still do. And so they said, well, we can't be under NATO. So the head of NATO forces, George Jalwin, who was American four-star, said, okay, I got an idea. How about instead of being under the Supreme Allied Commander Europe for NATO, you become under the command of the American commander in Europe, they said, that's fine. That's back to the Cold War. And, we're a big country. We met at the Elba in 1945. Oh, we can do that. That's fine. Good. So instead of being under the command of George Jalwin, SACEUR, you'll be under the command of the American commander in Europe, who's called George Jalwin. And it worked. They sent their best troops, etc. But then we forgot about it under the team that said, okay. And so a number of bad things happened. And incidentally, at the Munich conference of the Munich Security Conference in 2007, Mr. Putin showed up. I happened to be there. And he said, you guys aren't playing fair. And he was not wrong. Incidentally, at the time, he said, I like Mr. Bush. We get along very well. We can make things work. And everybody said, oh, to hell with him. He's just a loser. And then in 2008, for complicated reasons, the American president decided, I want to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. Well, that was an absolute no-no. Basically because the Allies aren't prepared to go to war for Georgia. Uh, and I'm not even talking about Sherman, in
Right.
Georgia. I'm talking about Saakashvili in the other Georgia, the original Georgia, and Ukraine. The Allies say, "Are you kidding? If we want to have a war with Russia or something like that, let's bring them into Ukraine." And one thing people have to know about membership in NATO, it takes unanimity.
Mm.
There are now 32 members. There are about to be 32 with Finland and Sweden. Whether it's a good idea or not, we'll see. Anyone can say no. And the French and Germans say, no, we are not prepared to have them in. That made a dead letter. But NATO said, anyway, Ukraine and NATO will become members of NATO. I was there at the time, sitting outside, and I said, don't they understand what they did? That's the commitment. Well, Mr. Saakashvili understood it in Georgia, and he went into South Ossetia to try to get that back. The Russians slapped him down. Nobody came to his help. And I said at the time, I hope we don't prank around with Ukraine. Well, we did, because we kept saying time after time, Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And the last time we said it was at the NATO Summit this last September. I mean, after the war started. Come on, give me a break.
Yeah.
Well, that does not justify anything that Putin did. Nothing whatsoever. He is an aggressor. He's a thug. He's a bad guy. Whether we're ever going to be able to deal with him again is a moot point, in part because what he's done. And there are certain limits to which you can't go beyond in terms of dealing with people who behave the way he has. He's a war criminal, no question. Whether Mr. Biden should have called him a war criminal is one of the things you have to think about. My old view about that, about the International Court of Justice, etc., it's like the old idea of the recipe for alligator soup.
Yeah.
Step, catch an alligator.
Right.
The first thing you do is you catch the guy, and then you can take him there. Okay, so in 2014, these an assistant secretary, maybe Putin was already going to do what he did because he had this stuff all the time about what we've been saying about it, and maybe he decided, based upon what happened 1,000 years ago. Last year, a year ago, July, he put out this 6,800-word screed, which went all the way back to say, well, Ukraine never really existed, etc. He didn't write it. He couldn't possibly have written. He may not have even read it. It was done by some monk off in a monastery somewhere, except for the end. And in the end, there are some ideas that maybe we should negotiate. In fact, Mr. Biden had a very good summit with Putin in Geneva, just as, and I'm now going to horrify everybody, Mr. Trump had a very good summit with Putin in Helsinki, except that the media decided he was going to be toast because of all the things he'd done, and they were going to impeach him no matter what happened, and so he never could get a break. And so he used this influence of the thing. They said, what about the Russians interfering in the American election of 2016?
Yeah.
In which people like to believe it was because the Russians. That was nonsense. Of course, the Russians didn't change it. Are you kidding? Do you think Russian influence up in Wisconsin and places like that? Give me a break. It was, Hillary Clinton was a lousy candidate. I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I love the woman, and she did a great job as senator, etc. And she wasn't too bad as Secretary of State, so she didn't know much about foreign affairs. So they asked him, what about interference in our election? And he said, I have full confidence in the American intelligence community. But I have to say, Mr. Putin made a good case. That's not agreeing with Mr. Putin. So what it's,
right.
Look it up. It's on the internet. You can watch it live. You could read the thing. But okay, they landed on it. Putin then says, they had this joint press conference, and so did Trump. Here are things we agreed upon that we could do together. All excellent things. Not a single one got done because we were so preoccupied. Well, okay, we got to 2014. At that point, maybe Putin had already decided, I'm going to seize Crimea and the Russian-speaking parts of southeastern Ukraine. It is a country, like a lot that have different languages spoken. Belgium, for example,
Sure.
Canada, and the United States more
Yeah.
rapidly than people understand. And there are a lot of people who saw themselves more as Russians than Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians refused to give any kind of autonomy or capacity to even use their language. It was dumb on their part. But okay, maybe Putin had done it anyway. Assistant Secretary of State goes to Kyiv and ran a coup. How do we know? Because she got on first she came back home and she got on the telephone to the American ambassador in Ukraine, and the person who had been elected was pro-Soviet, and when you had the demonstrations in the street, he fled. He ran off to Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So this woman gets on the phone to our ambassador in Kyiv on an open line. We should spend $1 billion a year on security on an open line. It's on the internet. Russia
Right.
intercepted. It's on the internet. You can listen to it. And she said, "Who do we want to put in?" It's a coup d'état, right? And Putin used that as an excuse, at least, for what he did 3 weeks later. Incidentally, that person who did it is now number 3 at the State Department, but that's another matter. I'll let people worry about that on their own. Okay. NATO responded to that point, but in retrospect, probably not strongly enough. And of course, there's one thing, because Putin had broken all the rules. Not only the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, but also, and I'm sorry to bore your listeners with this, but these things matter. And
Yeah.
First thing you have to do is you got to read the documents. Don't listen to the media. They'll just tell you what they want to tell you. Read the documents. In 1994, there was worried about the leftover nuclear weapons, which Ukraine had a lot. In fact, that's where they built the huge rockets. It's a serious country in terms of building things, and also Belarus and Kazakhstan. So there was an agreement. All of those nuclear weapons are going to go back into Russia, and they'll take care of them. They'll get rid of a lot of them in agreements with us. But the United States, Russia, and Britain, with the tacit support of the other 2 big nuclear powers, France and China, said, under this agreement, there must not be any threat to any of the countries giving up the nuclear weapons, and certainly not an attack. And Putin broke that. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Now, one of the reasons people didn't get too upset is because Crimea shouldn't have been in Ukraine in the first place. It was part of in the Soviet Union, it was part of the Russian part of the Soviet Union. Until in 1953, Khrushchev, who was a Ukrainian, said, as a birthday present, 300 years of working together with Ukraine, we will give the Crimea to Ukraine. Didn't make a difference. I was about to say it'd be like Texas giving the Alamo to Oklahoma, but that's much more serious. Much more serious. So Crimea shouldn't have been in Ukraine in the first place, but still he broke the rules.
Right.
Okay, and then in this last year, he invaded Ukraine. And the question is, what do you do about it? And I think maybe the verbal policy of this administration has not always been the most deft. Sometimes the president says a bit more than he should, but I think he's got it about right in terms of supporting Ukraine and at the same time preventing a direct conflict between the United States and Russia. The last time that happened directly was 1919. A lot of people forget that we invaded Russia try to get rid of the Bolsheviks in 1919. Okay, long time ago. And so we have provided them with an awful lot of equipment for the Ukrainians to use. And so have the Europeans, a bit reluctantly, many of them. And the Ukrainians, God bless them, surprised everybody by pushing the Russians back. A lot of people here said, oh, well, Ukraine's finished. Oh, I guess we'll live with that. The Ukrainians said, are you kidding? We're going to defend our country. And they've been doing a brilliant job. But the president also had to worry about, you don't want this to go to a direct confrontation, and you don't want to get into nuclear weapons, because Putin kept talking about nuclear weapons. He's stopped doing that. Now, The idea for Putin to use nuclear weapons for anything except a direct assault on Russia proper without these new territories would be the height of insanity. Insanity. Unfortunately, our president said, well, if that happened, we might have Armageddon, which, frankly, probably would have happened anyway. Us nuclear strategists would say, but you don't want to say a thing like that. It was, well, okay. So we now, I think, have put the nuclear thing aside. And so the question now is, how do you wind this thing down? Will the Russians be prepared to negotiate? And if they are prepared to negotiate, on the basis, frankly, of a thing that until the invasion of last February 24th was on the table, called the Minsk Agreement.
Right.
Go read it. The Minsk Agreement said, in effect, those parts of Ukraine, the Donbass and all of that, which are essentially Russian-speaking, can have autonomy. We can have elections and all that kind of stuff, and Russia will respect it. Well, the Russians didn't go along with it. The Ukrainians didn't go along. But that's the basis. This, incidentally, if they wanted to have negotiations, is the kind of thing any intelligent negotiator could wrap up in about a day and a half. It doesn't work that way because things like that never wrap up like that. But that's where we are now. And so I think I give Mr. Biden overall pretty good marks on that, because he's made sure that Ukraine would be able to push back, didn't give them so much that they could take the war directly into Russia. And they know that if they did that, because we got a lot at stake here, it's not just about Ukraine, it's about a lot of other things. It's about stability in Europe. It's about security in the world. It's about human rights. It's about abiding by the rules. And Putin has violated both of those. Right now, of course, Mr. Zelensky also doesn't want to negotiate. I understand that. But at some point, we're going to have some smart people in this administration to get together and figure it out. And the one place I will fault the administration, you don't want me to be just all praise, right?
Yeah.
Is I'm not sure there's anybody in there who's thought about the old line, Europe whole and free and at peace. Russia is not going to go away. They will at some point again be a major power. We collectively, on both sides, lost the opportunities which we had in the 1990s and up until the current war. But all we have done now, in terms of what I've just said, is delayed the moment in which we're going to have to deal with Russia in some way or another. The Secretary of Defense said incautiously earlier this year, what we're trying to do is weaken Russia so much so they can't do this again someplace else. Not a smart thing to say. Putin ran with that. He had a wonderful time. He said, this is what they're trying to do to us. We have to understand why the war is so popular in Russia. It's because he said NATO was surrounding us with members. We were. It said, we're a great power. They're not taking us seriously as a great power. We weren't. Well, somebody's got to be thinking about it in the future. It's probably going to be after Mr. Biden no longer is president, even if he has a second term. And we're not doing the thinking on that. Now, that's just on the Ukraine bit. We can talk about that more if we want. Or we can talk about other things that are at stake.
Yeah. Well, and that was also a half-hour long answer. So,
I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect. I want you to do that because you know this stuff and you know the treaties and you know the treaty before the treaty. That's why we're talking, right? Because we have time to do this. You don't have to do this in 7 minutes. So I love it. When we talk about like how much we hate Donald Trump in the media and how much that hamstrings his ability to get something right. And that's also attached to Donald Trump's purposeful, like, I'm going to make this error right here on TV and I don't care. And then you're like, well, if you would stop making mistakes and if these guys over here would quit lying about every single thing that you do that's bad, maybe there's some good things in that presidency. Donald
President
Trump.
Who? President who?
I'm saying Donald Trump, right? Like President Trump.
Who's Donald Trump? Good news the other night in the election.
Yeah.
Democracy is back, and even the naysayers have to recognize.
Yeah.
Secondly, Donald Trump is history.
So in terms of Donald Trump's
now, Mr. DeSantis, look, the Republicans were not going to have Donald Trump around in 2024 because the other people who want the job weren't prepared to wait 7 years to have a shot at it.
Yeah.
So the Republicans are going to get rid of Trump, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
Speaking as a Democrat.
Let me ask you this about foreign policy in Donald Trump. So Donald Trump sends his Jewish son-in-law to the Middle East and starts brokering deals in the Abraham Accords. I don't know what to make of it. I mean, the news always talks negatively about anything Donald Trump accomplishes, but this seems pretty remarkable to me, to use business as an avenue towards stability and Israel in the Middle East. So are the Abraham Accords, are they consequential? Are they good? Are they bad? And then has the Biden administration done anything with this opportunity to either expand or solidify?
Well, to begin with, one has to understand one of the fundamentals of American foreign policy, as I've already recognized. We, the American people, support Israel's existence, its livelihood, its success.
Right.
Every administration has done this since 1947, okay, and 48, when Israel became independent. And we don't divide on that. We may divide on what we should be doing about it, on how much one should let Israel do what it wants, as opposed to things that might interfere with negotiations. I worked for Jimmy Carter in the White House on Europe and then the Middle East after Camp David and the treaty between Egypt and Israel. I didn't do that. I can't take any credit for that. So if you want me to take the credit, I'll do it, but it's not true. Mm-hmm. One of the things that Mr. Carter believed that Mr. Reagan, Prime Minister, had given him was a pledge: no more settlement construction in the West Bank until such time as what we call the autonomy talks, as some self-government for Palestinians, was done. Reagan went home and decided he'd given away too much, and he said, I didn't agree to that. Mr. Carter said he did. Well, I go with my president, not with their prime minister. And some various administrations have given away a lot. I think it was Trump who said, okay, Israel can have the Golan Heights permanently. Bad idea. The movement of the embassy to Jerusalem, not a great idea. The pressure now to take over the West Bank altogether, Mr. Biden so far has not done that. That's not a great idea. Now, the Abraham Accords, we have to see a broader context here. The biggest challenge to the regional countries, as they all see it, with a couple of exceptions. Oman doesn't see it this way, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays, Kuwait doesn't see it this way, but Mondays and Thursdays they do. But the big threat is Iran, okay? And the Iranian Revolution, which continues. But if we look at the genuine strategic concerns, the one that matters is Iran not getting a nuclear weapon. Now that is a true game changer, not just in the Middle East, but for an awful lot of people elsewhere. And it's also the number one U.S. national security concern. Now, for the countries out there, that's also their concern, but they also want other things out of Iran. And the Trump administration under Mr. Pompeo, Secretary of State, who wants to be president, he's not on my short list, but that's another matter, came up with 12 requirements that Iran had to face before we would deal with it. And those 12 requirements were, in effect, capitulation. That's what they are. If you read them, mm-hmm. It's also giving up the Alamo, right? Mm-hmm. This administration is kind of following along with those two. So the Abraham Accords were a desire of Arab countries of the Persian Gulf to make common cause with Israel. One is a positive element for them, support for their economies. One has to understand that Israel is one of the great successful economies, particularly in high technology.
Right.
It's fantastic. I don't know whether you've been to Israel. I've been there about 15 times. Fantastic country and fantastic qualified people. As one said, if you had one orchestra for Israel, you would have 500 people who want to play first violin. Very talented people, all right? If you want to do something in in terms of technology. You're going to have as many companies you can find anywhere. It's fantastic. So they want part of that. But they also want to work with Israel against Iran to stop them from getting the bomb. All right. And other things. Now we have to go back to Mr. Obama. He understood this. And he was very courageous. After Jimmy Carter, he was the next most courageous president we've had in terms of dealing with the Middle East. And he negotiated a thing called, here it comes again, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, 2015, intensely opposed by various countries in the Middle East, and especially Israel. The Prime Minister of Israel came to a joint session of Congress and asked members of Congress to support him in opposing this agreement instead of supporting the President of the United States. It's an amazing thing. Well, Obama got it passed, not a treaty because you probably couldn't cut through the Senate. And what it meant was sanctions that had been imposed on Iran because of its nuclear program would come off. And they did at the beginning of January 2016. At the same time, Iran would stop all those things that could help it build a bomb. What did it do? It poured concrete in its nuclear reactor that makes plutonium. It took 90% of the uranium it was enriching and it sold it abroad. It sold to the Russians, actually, because enriched uranium is needed for people with power stations. They did all that. And so that was working. It didn't have the added impact we had hoped of helping to do something with positive relations, in part because the day after the agreement went into effect, the United States Treasury Department, probably without the knowledge of the president, imposed new sanctions. At the same time, the Iranians started testing ballistic missiles, even though they're not forbidden in the JCPOA. They're not. There's a pretty place in there, but it's not agreed. So both sides immediately started whittling away at the corners, and we lost that opportunity. Trump comes in, and for a variety of factors, he says, I don't like anything Obama did. So let's get rid of the JCPOA. So in 2019, he quit it. Got out of it unilaterally. He broke America's word on that, and also broke what was needed to keep the Iranians honest. And let me tell you, the inspections in Iran have not been matched anywhere else in the world historically. None of the people wander around there looking for stuff. It's just amazing. Okay? It was one way in which the 2003 invasion of Iraq was to get rid of weapons of mass destruction. Well, under the first war, Iraq agreed to allow the UN and everybody to come in and inspect. They came in and did it. And then after the 2003 war, we found there weren't any weapons of mass destruction. The UN had gotten rid of them. Of course, Saddam didn't want to admit he was naked. That's another matter. That was an error of judgment. Okay, so after a year, 2019, the Iranians said, okay, we're going to restart our programs, which they've been doing. And they have been working on things that could become a bomb at some point. Now, various people have been saying for 2 years, 3 years now, they're a month away from getting the bomb.
Right.
Been saying it for 3 years. Now, the latest number I saw yesterday was they're now within 7 days of getting it. That's rubbish. Come on. You don't do this like Bill Gates in a garage building Microsoft. But even if they get the fissionable materials, getting from there to a deliverable weapon is a long time down the road. Well, what should Mr. Biden have done when he came in? What I said at the time, he should simply have said, we're going to rejoin the JCPOA. We just rejoin it. And as we rejoin it, let me get rid of a phone call here. I think somebody's watching your program. There's a lot.
Yeah. Joe's calling you. Shut up. Shut up.
Okay, and what he should have done is said, okay, I'm going to rejoin right now. And we're going to take off those sanctions related to the bomb of 2015. Charge the Iranians with stopping and going back to where they were in 2016, beginning of the implementation. And if they don't, then we'll have snapback, put back all the sanctions, maybe do more, And incidentally, the other signatories in Europe and with the Chinese and the Russians might say, we will now support stronger efforts against Iran. He didn't do it. Trump had a domestic constituency to work with. Mr. Biden has a domestic constituency to work with. That was bad policy. And I've said it since the beginning. In fact, you could still do it tomorrow morning if you wanted. Everybody says, no, the talks have failed and we now have to have plan B, because quite frankly, we are on the hook and have been since before Biden. We will not let Iran get the bomb. I say it again. We will not let Iran get the bomb. Mr. Biden has pledged that. Other presidents would have done it too, which means if they get close to a bomb, that means war. Let's face it, American people don't want another war. I would have thought it was better to. There's some people calculating, well, the Iranians won't do it anyway, but this is extremely dangerous. In terms of, it's at least as dangerous to security as what's going on in Ukraine. And now that the midterms are over, maybe the administration will be able to think that one through again. But that's one I think they haven't gotten right. Now, the Abraham Accords. So these countries say, okay, let's work with Israel. Now, one of the questions is, if indeed the Iranian issue were taken care of, particularly on the bomb, would the Abraham Accords continue? Who knows? I don't know.
No.
Because when it comes to negotiating with Arab-Israeli, the Saudis say, as they look at this, we're happy to negotiate on the basis of the proposal we made 10 years ago. And the basis of that, and what number one line in that proposal is, Israel has to start by negotiating based on the lines of 1967. Israel's not going to do it. It's not going to happen. Never going to happen. So right now, the chances of serious progress on Arab-Israeli peacemaking are exactly zero. You don't necessarily have Palestinians who can negotiate seriously, and there's no Israeli government is prepared to take risk for peace. The last Israeli prime minister was prepared to was Yitzhak Rabin, and the right wingers assassinated him. Okay, I understand Israeli fears, etc., but we also have a dog in that fight, and but nothing's going to happen on that venture for the foreseeable future. Biden's done a couple of things. For example, we did have a representation in Jerusalem for years and years and years, which were our guys to talk to the Palestinians. They did not work for the embassy in Tel Aviv as it was. They worked directly with the State Department. When Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, he put that intersection under the embassy there. Mr. Biden has reversed that, which is a positive step. That gets down in the weeds. This is something that it would take more than a few negotiators to get right.
Yeah.
But as I say on the Iranian thing, the President of the United States can change the game overnight if he wanted to. But domestic politics won't let him do it. I understand that. And I hope people are prepared for the possibility of a war against Iran.
Right. The other thing about the embassy moving that I'd like to ask about is, every president previous to Trump for like 4 or 5 presidents has said, I'm going to move it to Jerusalem.
Absolutely.
But they didn't, right? And so why would you even say something like that if you're president? Is that just a slip up or,
But it was always done in the context of work on overall peace process.
Okay.
It was never all by itself. Frankly, I don't think it is an important thing because one thing that Arabs and Muslims agree upon is that there should not be foreign sovereignty over the holy places of Islam. I have a very bad joke I tell about this. If you're in the Middle East business, you got to have a sense of humor. You go crazy, which is God lacked imagination. He put the holiest places of Judaism in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
First or second or third, maybe the first holiest place of Christianity in Jerusalem. The second holiest places of Islam in Jerusalem, on
Yeah.
top, literally on top of the holiest places of Islam,
Yeah.
of Judaism, and 100 meters down the road from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
Yeah.
It's all in a bunch, instead of putting one in the Gobi Desert and one in Mexico or somewhere. I tell you what, and this is big stuff. However, my judgment is, if you had worked out an agreement between Israel and the Arabs on the West Bank, Gaza, an independent state for the Palestinians with all kinds of security for Israel, all kinds of security. And then you got to Jerusalem at the end. The religious leaders in Jerusalem could work that out in 24 hours. Teddy Kollek, who used to be the Jewish mayor of all of Jerusalem, could have done it in 24 hours.
Hmm.
That's the easy part. You just give control over particular sectors. The Jews get the western wall of the temple
Mm-hmm.
and the time and place in front of it. The Christians get the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and sort out their problems. You know, it's a different Christian sects demand a different part of the ritual. It's a Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In 1888, they had a conference in Berlin, and the Catholics get this, the Maronites get that, etc. And the key to the Holy Sepulchre is held by a Muslim, right? Because you can't trust any of the Christians. And then you give the sites on the top of the mount that the Muslims care about to Muslim control. Incidentally, the Dome of the Rock, people have to know this. Everybody out there knows the history. The Dome of the Rock covers Mount Moriah. This was where Abraham supposedly was going to do the sacrifice of Isaac, right?
Right.
Jewish tradition. Sacrifice of Ishmael, Muslim tradition.
So it's meaningless.
So the big thing now is figuring out the tactical approach with regard to Ukraine and the long-term strategic approach to European security, which has many moving parts, but particularly what are you going to do about Russia over time? And then in the Middle East, most important thing is, in my judgment, rejoin the JCPOA. Do the right thing there. If it doesn't work with Iran, then you can do worse things even we're doing now. But at least give it a try.
Yeah, if you could look at China for a sec here and just kind of give us an overview on how we're doing with that. On the middle side, we're all just desperate for a war with Russia or China. We want to put tanks on the field, and we're begging for it, right? But the reality is nobody wants a war with China or a war with Russia. So what are your thoughts on China?
One of the important things to understand, which differentiates China from Russia in particular, and also Iran, is there is no contiguous territory on the ground with China that we care about, except the far end, once you get through North Korea to South Korea, and a bit of Southeast Asia. Okay. And these islands in the middle of the South Pacific, and then the status of Taiwan, which Xi Jinping is, for domestic reasons, has blown that up, and we've done this kind of thing. And I don't think either country wants to fight over Taiwan. We had the Shanghai Agreement of back in 1971 when Nixon went, amplified by Jimmy Carter. Good basis for dealing with that. I regretted that Nancy Pelosi went out there and stirred the pot. All it did was just get involved in Chinese domestic politics. That's point one. The chances of a land war with China are very, very low, and that's good news. Second thing, of course, is China is going to be a great power. Not just a great economic power, where we're still first, and I'd rather live in this country. I'd rather work in the American economy. We're still the more innovative country.
Mm.
We're still the country in which people want to come and study. We're the only country that's thinking about building a wall to keep people out rather than to keep them in.
Yeah.
China is trying to prove that you can have a functioning economy without people having a chance for greater self-expression. Maybe they can do it over time. I have no idea. There were two countries out there that found that they could not continue to, small countries, continue to support growing economies without having radical changes of domestic politics, Taiwan and South Korea, which started out doing their economies and then only later on did that. But one of the, and we're going to have to deal with China. I'm not going to try to get into the tactics of it, except to understand. I think we should stop talking about the world being divided between democracies and autocracies. I mean, we tend to deal with autocracies too when it's in our interest, and these are important issues. But once you start dividing things like that, you get yourself locked into things that deny you maybe the flexibility you need later on, and also deny maybe the kinds of historical processes that might work. Okay, that's point number two. Point number three, I would argue, is that we don't have the kinds of coherent understanding of China in relationship to ourselves and to other countries that we have with regard to Europe. The number of Americans in and out of government know a lot about Europe is huge.
Mm-hmm.
It has been for a long time, certainly beginning in 1942 and onwards, despite the period of the interwar period. The number of people who are engaged in the Middle East is huge. But when you come to dealing with China, we have some people who say it's all about Chinese nuclear weapons. It's all about Chinese conventional weapons. It's all about seizing islands in the South China Sea, which you have no right to do, particularly against, and this is one of the tragedies of American history, a classic enemy relationship in that part of the world going back 2,000 years is China and Indochina, and particularly Vietnam. We never fully understood that during the Vietnam War. Never fully understood it. Okay? And in fact, China and Vietnam went to war with one another. So we have people who worry about Taiwan, South Korea, in terms of these. We also have people who are worried about North Korea, nuclear weapons, and we have to work with China in regard to the containment of North Korea. We are not in a position to put North Korea in a box. China is much better prepared to do that than we are. And for that, we need to keep them on side. All right, somehow. Got to deal with that. We have the U.S. business community, mostly, who want to have it free and open in dealing with China. And we now find with some of the problems we have domestically that was probably not such a good idea to become dependent on microchips and the like and other things. The American economy depended on China. Incidentally, one of the ironies of this is microchips, we are more dependent on Taiwan than on China. Okay. China is also dependent a lot on Taiwan. Do they want to just, in getting China to Taiwan back, do they want to destroy that economy? This is not Hong Kong. This is a major functioning economy. Then we have the human rights people, which is very important. What the Chinese are doing in Xinjiang, which is mostly Muslim, not entirely, and of course what they did a long time ago in Tibet, which we seem to have forgotten about. Mm-hmm. And they are a country, overwhelmingly, who believe in ethnic purity and in system purity, the Han Chinese. Japanese are like that too, but that's much less consequential. We in the West, we have coped with that. We've been forced to cope with that in so many different countries. As I say, you only have to go up to Quebec to see that.
Yeah.
So they've coped with that. But the human rights people are quite right in looking at what is the largest concentration camp of the world, which is now Xinjiang in China. The second largest, incidentally, is Gaza, but that's something we don't talk about. And so you have different constituencies in the United States, and part of it is we don't have enough people with the background experience. We have a lot of extraordinarily good people, but they don't have the deep resonance within broader society. And as far as I can tell, we don't have the mechanisms yet, which we're going to have to develop, to trying to play these off against one another and see how we reconcile them and how you come up with a set of policies, which are not just tactical things. Are we going to have sanctions or not have sanctions for one reason or another? Are we going to try to work with them militarily or not? We've got to find a way of doing all of this, understanding another thing. The Chinese understand and we understand. We're going to have to inhabit this world together. We think we have a better methodology for doing it. They think they have a better methodology. However, they're deeply enmeshed in the American leadership of the system we managed to create after 1945. They're not oblivious to it. They're deeply engaged in it. And our countries, in terms of our economic relationship, even though we're going to try to separate, it's inseparable. Too late. Sorry about that. Too late. Both countries would, and others would suffer. But competing with China, we're going to have to do an awful lot of that. But to try to keep on both sides the rhetoric under control. And one of the things to watch for, the writers should watch for, is next week, the president of China that's not actually his title, but let's say in effect, and the president of the United States are going to meet together. I think it's at the G20 they're going to meet together. I hope they're going to meet together. And I hope they can, now that Xi has got his party Congress over, and he could be the leader as long as he can take breath until somebody else comes along. And Biden may be around for another 6 years, and certainly the United States has got, I'm sorry, I should have said at the beginning, American foreign policy has more continuity than change. Always. Always more continuity than change. For one thing, it's the same world out there. We only get one vote. We got the number one vote, but only one vote. So we hope that Mr. Xi and Mr. Biden will be able to start working out some rules of the road by which we can start sorting out some important things. Let me go back to that thing. New administration comes in. I've seen it several times. I've done it several times. New team comes in. New party said, oh, what the last party did, that was a lot of garbage. I'm going to do something totally different in the world, and in 6 months, you'll watch everything's changed. 6 months later, they say, you know, that previous gang, they weren't so stupid. Because the world doesn't care who's in power or which party's in power here. They deal with America and American interests and American values. They'll have to deal with whoever president of the United States is, full stop. And he or she, sooner rather than later, is amazingly consequential and will continue to be. And the great news of the week is that the great unknown of America and the world took a major step in the right direction. Democracy is functioning in America. The American people are rescuing democracy from the pundits.
I have one more question for you, and you can answer as long as you want because I love it. I'm absolutely enjoying this.
Well, I'm talking, so I'm enjoying it.
Yeah. Okay. So by some crazy miracle, Pete becomes president in 2024, and I call Robert on the phone, and I'm like, "I give you like 2 things that you can do to improve our capacity in foreign policy. What are the things that you want me to create with you? Like, what would you say? Like, I want to do this, and I want to do this. I don't necessarily mean like I want to go to Georgia and do something. I mean, how do we improve our
It's
capacity
Georgia.
here? Yeah, all of them, all the Georgias, Georgia Island, South Georgia, whatever. But
South Georgia, yes, okay.
what would be the things that you would do to improve our capacity to improve our foreign policy outcomes?
Well, one is obvious: hire good people.
Okay, all right.
Hire. No, this is not an easy. And hire people with a strategic sense. We haven't done that for a long time. The last person who did it was George H.W. Bush with was a full team with Brent Scowcroft, who worked for different presidents at different times and managed even to cope with Henry Kissinger. Incidentally, Henry, if he's not dead by then, would still be volunteer to be Secretary of State again. Trust me, would. He's only 99. So that's really the most important thing. It's a fundamental management tool. You come into office, Pete comes into office, and you say, now, what am I good at? I'm a good communicator. I'm good at thinking about politics, which is called as the second thing, which is make sure you have a good relationship with the Congress and the American people. But I don't know as much as I need to know about foreign policy. And I certainly don't know a lot about how I fit part A to part B and relate them together. I'm going to find myself the very best people to do that. And I'm going to listen to them and I'm going to make them work together. System for that already exists if it's followed. But it's finding these people, because you will find, whichever political party you get in, you get a lot of people saying, my turn, my turn. And the tendency is to appoint people who are in your campaign or you owe something to, or who've been in the media, or who've written a book, rather than sorting out and looking around. And what I've recommended to now, I think 3 candidates for president, is what you need to do in the campaign is get somebody close to you who you trust implicitly, but who does not want a job and would not take a job if offered. And send that person out quietly to beat the Bushes. I mean, not beating George Bush and family.
Yeah.
And start talking to lots and lots of people about who knows this or that, not the tactics. You can find a China expert or a Russia expert. There are a lot of them out there. But people who know how to make things work together, who have an overall strategic view, geostrategic view. People who are, among other things, going to be able to deal with the enormity of an issue we haven't talked about. There's only one issue that really matters in the world today. Only one. It's climate change. That's it. Because whatever else we're talking about is going to be moot within 20 or 30 years, if not sooner, if we don't get a handle on that. And they're now down in Indonesia, not in Indonesia, but that'll be later. They're in Sharm el-Sheikh, which is symbolic because of all the Arab-Israeli that's been done there. They're not going to come up with anything that's useful, unfortunately. I don't want to get into that. So that's what I would tell President Pete to do. And a team, not that can work together. And the second thing is making sure that people have your ear and disagree with you.
I love it. Yes.
And not get shot.
Yeah.
I have seen at least one president, Jimmy Carter, who his national security advisor, Brzezinski, could come in and say, Mr. President, I disagree with you. And instead of being shot, I remember an occasion where we were in Jerusalem with Bob Strauss, who was the negotiator for autonomy. And something came up that Begin was complaining about. Strauss came to me and he said, what's going on? And I said, well, the State Department's doing thus and so. And I think the State Department's got it wrong. And he said, what do I do? I said, call the president. Call the president. He said, Mr. President, what you're doing on this, State Department's doing it, you're going to get in deep trouble. He said, you're wrong. He said, Mr. President, trust me. Check it out. Call comes back 2 hours later. The president said, I checked it out. You're right. I'm reversing the policy.
Nice. Wow.
Okay?
Yeah.
Other presidents can do that. Whether Mr. Biden is prepared to do that, I don't know. We know Mr. Trump was not prepared to do it. Clinton would occasionally. Incidentally, Clinton was better at listening to military people than most are.
Yeah.
In part, I think, because he was a draft dodger. And so John Saakashvili, if I pronounced that correctly, who was Georgian heritage. He was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Had a wonderful relationship with the president, who could tell him in terms the president would accept. Mr. President, I don't think that's a good idea. Let's do this. So those are two things I would do, and they're process things.
Mm-hmm.
And then question the intelligence. John Kennedy, for example, learned a lesson at the Bay of Pigs. The intelligence community under Eisenhower and his immediate team said, this would be a great idea. And as Kennedy said to his cabinet the day after it happened, and a friend of mine was in the room, Kennedy said, well, we really took a kick in the ass on that one. Well, at that point, Kennedy understood, boy, I got to have different source of information. I'm going to think for myself. So we got to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Kennedy didn't listen to the people who just said, we got to invade, got to do this. He did the full spectrum. Lyndon Johnson, who tragically was the fall guy for Vietnam. And incidentally, everybody in the Johnson administration who proposed going forward had been appointed by Kennedy, every single one. I was in the White House at the time of Tonkin Gulf. Okay, there you are. But what he would do in domestic policy, he would call 30 people, 20 people, and he knew what they were all going to say. It was the person who said something different.
Yeah.
He said, I better pay attention to that. That's called being president.
Yeah.
National Security Council, when I was there, was 60 senior people total for the whole world. It's now 600. And we had the responsibility of linking policies to one another and always trying to say, how do you think presidentially? How do you know that anything I tell the president, he might act on? And there's no fault with most presidents. And you got to be, President Beach, you got to be sure of this. If somebody says to you, Mr. President, I don't know, but I'll find out, your answer is, do that, please.
Yeah.
Don't fire him because he doesn't know.
Yeah.
I look forward to your being president. And if you follow, these are basic rules of management.
Yeah.
Rules.
The
one skill you really need is a political skill.
Yeah.
President of the United States is a political job. It's how do you broker differences of opinion? That's what government's about in a democracy. How do you broker differences of interest, differences of opinion? That's what it's about. And you got to be good at that. Some have been better than others.
If I was to be president, one of the things I would do too is I would invite Americans in to see the process of being president. And I would have people like do ride-alongs with me so they can see like this. None of this stuff is easy. We're working hard every day, and let them go back to their districts and go like, these guys are all working hard. They're smart people doing things. We are so distant from that process now. I don't think Americans believe that there's good people in the government on both sides. They just think it's just a bunch of dimwits that somehow got in charge. But there's a lot of brilliant people in Washington, D.C.
All right, let me tell you on that. I've been doing this now since the Lyndon Johnson White House. Okay?
Yeah.
And I know an awful lot of people, have known a lot of people. To begin with, 98% of the people in government want to do a good job. 99%. There's some jerks. There's some self-interest people. There's some people who go into it so they can make money afterwards by writing a kiss and tell book. That's a tiny minority. Whether they're career people or political people, 99% of people, the American people can be proud of. And also there are an awful lot of talented people. One of Hunter's rules, and I got a bunch of them about how to do this, is a president, when he's faced with major decisions, needs to task his people, find the person in the government who really knows something about this. Find that person and listen to them, and let me listen to them. There were some, for example, Colin Powell would occasionally take one of his junior people in to see his president, the president. When I was at the NSC, and we would sometimes we'd regularly get briefing papers from the State Department to give to the President of the United States, who was going to go off and make major decisions with his colleagues. Most of the time, these State Department briefing papers were pablum because they went all these clearance processes and people were scared to do it. So what I would do is I'd pick up the phone, let's say I was going to see the British Prime Minister, and I would call the desk officer for Britain in the State Department. And I'd say, tell them who I am, what I'm doing. What should the president say to the prime minister? Oh, oh God, he'd say the following things. I said, that's fantastic. I'm going to put it in the brief for the president of the United States. How come it was not in the State Department? He said it wasn't when I sent it up, and it got taken out. Find the people. That's a key thing. Find the people who know what they're doing and listen to them.
Yeah.
Any chief executive will tell you that.
I love it. All right. Well, listen, let's wrap it up. I don't want to take any more of your time. This has all been fantastic. It always is. It's always so much fun to talk to you. Anything in closing?
Just people need to focus on American democracy, have confidence, and if you really want to know what's going on, don't listen to the regular mainstream media, whether it's Fox or CNN or somebody else. Listen to lots of sources. Read a lot of things. Don't listen to anybody, one person, including me, even though I'd be delighted if everything I said got followed. Find some foreign media, whatever it is. Think for yourselves, because I'll tell you, if the average American doesn't think for him and herself, which is what we saw 2 days ago to a great extent, somebody else is going to think for you and is ready to do that. Okay.
I love it. Stand by. I'm going to shut this thing down.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly,